At first glance, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a lot like Remake in terms of its design and graphical fidelity and its overall presentation. And that's something that you'd probably come to expect going into a sequel these days, where it doesn't look like it's going to be a massive leap or have any major changes until you get your hands on it for yourself. What I mean by this is like how Tears of the Kingdom is to Breath of the Wild, or God of War Ragnarok is to God of War, or Horizon Forbidden West is to Zero Dawn, Jedi Survivor is to Fallen Order. You get the point. Visually, these sequels don't look all that different, but there's usually a fundamental difference that sets them apart. They've all gotten bigger, and it feels like you've taken another step into a bigger, vaster world. Now that doesn't always make it a good thing, but it sure can make it exciting when done right. The entirety of Remake was only set in Midgar, and while they managed to make it feel large enough, it was always going to feel somewhat restricted, whereas in Rebirth, you're finally out there, and you have so much more of Gaia to explore. But given how stunning Remake looked, it made sense that those restrictions had to be made to sustain that quality, especially on the PS4. Here, however, even with it being a timed exclusive for the PS5, meaning only needing to optimize it for this platform for the time being, it definitely struggled to maintain it to that same degree. Now again, this is most probably because of how big the game is, but you would think that the PS5 would be enough of a powerhouse to properly handle it. But I suppose it's either the case of poor optimization, or perhaps the PS5 just isn't really as great of a powerhouse as we'd expect it to be. I don't know what the case is, I don't work in game dev, but I do know that the performance for this game, much like a lot of bigger games these days, wasn't great. I do suspect though that part of the reason could also be the differences between games every few years decrease simply because of the fact that as games continue to become more demanding, the longer the development cycle becomes. Now, I'm not somebody who is particularly picky about resolution or frame rate or even graphics, at least not as much as some people, but even I noticed when toggling between the performance and graphics modes that it was lacking. As I've mentioned several times in the past, like most, I typically prioritize frame rate. But for the first hour or two of the game, I played it in the graphics mode because when I tested it against the performance, the resolution seemingly tanked a lot. Thus I decided it might be best to stick with the mode it's defaulted to and play in 30. But after those couple hours, the frame rate actively began straining my eyes a ton. Normally, I can stomach 30 frames if that is the only option, or if it seems like the better of the two options, but I think that given the type of game that this is, with the faster paced combat, camera movement, and traversal, this is probably one of the worst games to play this at. Even from a control standpoint, in certain sections, especially in areas where you can only walk, it definitely made the sticks feel really stiff. And for a moment, I was wondering if my sticks were beginning to drift, and then I switched it to performance, and that feeling was immediately gone. I didn't feel nearly as much restraint or pullback on them. Visually, this game still looks really great. The combat is more refined, it's smooth, it's fluid, but it's really the visuals that always manages to make it look like a grand spectacle, no matter what. And even with these performance issues and not playing it with the best graphical fidelity settings, it still looks beautiful and looks spectacular. And I think that says a lot about how much more important art style and art design is compared to graphics. It's part of the reason why games like The Wind Waker, which is turning 21 years old this year, still look so incredible, even to this day. Now I can say, it wasn't nearly as bad as Jedi Survivor's performance at launch last year, because that was abysmal, but this is in some pretty dire need of some more patches, and I hope that they're on their way soon. When Final Fantasy XVI launched last year, there was a bit of a divisive reception towards it. During that initial review window, there were a lot of critiques towards this game, but when it reached that wider audience and they decided to try it and play it for themselves, a lot of the people didn't really agree with the criticisms made by the critics. And they took it to mean that these critics meant, hey, I don't like the game. But that's very much not the case. I actually agree with some of what the critics were saying. Not entirely though, because there were some that claimed that this game was far too easy. And I don't think it was, because even for those who prefer a challenge, that's exactly what the other difficulty options were for. But the main problem that I had, as was echoed amongst these critics and reviewers like me, was that Final Fantasy XVI spent too much time on cutscenes rather than gameplay. The ratio between gameplay and cutscenes was heavily skewed, and this is coming from somebody that actually enjoys cutscenes and often defends them. I like narrative-driven games. I sit through them, and typically enjoy them a lot. And a lot of people will even call some of my favorite games nothing more than walking simulators riddled with cutscenes and whatnot. And yet, I'm always still prepared to defend them. In this case, however, I can't really do the same thing. Now, I wanted to be very clear that I actually did like Final Fantasy XVI, just not as much as some other people, and some other games. There was definitely some good stuff in there, but then there are people that will look at 16 and argue that its cutscene length isn't actually that long when you consider that Final Fantasy has always been known to have long cutscenes. And these people might even say, really, just JRPGs in general have long cutscenes. And yes, I agree. I recently made it through the Yakuza games, so I completely understand that. But the problem really lies in this. I don't really mind sitting through these long cutscenes, just as long as there's a better balance between the two. And I don't feel like 16 really achieved that. And when people compare it to Final Fantasy VII Remake and how long those cutscenes were, it's not even close. If you look them up on YouTube, you will find that the Remake's cutscenes will run about 12 hours, whereas 16's runs about 20. And according to How Long to Beat, it is around 37 hours. So when you have that much ratio where half of the game is essentially just cutscenes, then it doesn't really do a good job of balancing the two. This also doesn't necessarily make it a bad story or even technically a bad game, but when unbalanced, it can severely skew the pacing. Obviously, there are games out there that are very much focused on that, and are like the Life is Strange games and the Telltale games, which are basically just interactive dramas, but those are a different type of game. This is an ARPG at the end of the day, and when it comes to that, you have to have a certain set of other expectations for it that you wouldn't otherwise have for the other types of games. And so when I compare it to that sort of aspect alone to Final Fantasy VII Remake and now Rebirth, I find them to be significantly better entries that gets everything that I felt was missing from 16 right. Remake didn't spend too much of its time on gameplay, nor too much on cutscenes. It struck a really nice balance. And it's for that reason I really loved that game. Rebirth, on the other hand, still did a better job with balancing compared to 16, and I still overall preferred it. But I do think that in terms of pacing, it didn't do as well as Remake did. I do still think it did a pretty decent job for the most part, but towards the end, you could really feel that padding. Now, I don't know if that's actually due to the nature of what happens to a game when you essentially take one and then split it into three. I think it's inevitable that that sort of thing is going to happen, that some sort of level of padding is going to be in there, but that is what made some of those moments towards the end start to drag. And although I do think that first impressions do matter, it's really about where it all leads to and how it ends. The defining factor about how I ultimately feel about a game, or really any media I consume, is usually impacted by how I felt about it by the end. When 16's demo dropped before the actual game launched, and I played that, it had a tremendous first impression on me. I was not expecting the first 2 hours of the game to be as good as they were, and I couldn't wait for the release 2 weeks later. But when the full game finally released and I played through it all, I felt a little bit underwhelmed. And so when it comes to Rebirth and its ending, I felt it echoed in a similar way, somewhat underwhelmed and a little disappointed. I will say I did overall enjoy it more than 16, and again, I did like 16, just didn't love it, but I did feel as though the ending failed to live up to some of my expectations. Now, it's always hard to talk about the ending without divulging into specifics, because spoilers, but I will say that Rebirth's ending ultimately left me with more questions than answers. And I understand that this is a 3-parter, and I assume that all the questions will be answered by the next game, but at the same time, I kind of wish more was answered this time, instead of just leaving it so much more open-ended. That's kind of what I really enjoyed about Remake. It was the introduction to these characters in this setup. Obviously, if you had played the original, you would already be introduced to them, but it was also an introduction for a lot of newcomers like myself. And even then, the OG players still got enjoyment out of it because they left this mystery box that sort of set things up and got you to think about where they might be taking this. You think it's going one way, and then it goes another, and then you think, okay, maybe there's some changes, and I look forward to seeing where this goes. And since it's the first one, you would naturally assume that it's setting things up for the rest of the trilogy. Now obviously, we didn't know how many games there were going to be at the time, but I assumed that there was going to be a sequel. And when you're planning on making more than one, you need to create a build-up that leaves some mysteries to be solved, and then answered over the course of the next installments. So it made sense. But here, even though it's not the end of the trilogy, you would think that at least certain things should start to piece themselves together a little bit better. And unfortunately, I don't really feel like I got much of that. There were things that I sort of understood, but it also makes me wonder where they're taking this. It makes sense to feel that way during the first one, but by the second, you should have a clearer direction with clues that can be trailed. I respect that people can like the ending, love it even, but personally, I was really hoping for more, and I felt like because of the way certain events were executed, that some of that impact you would have otherwise felt kind of was diminished to some degree. Again, it's very difficult to talk about this stuff without spoiling it, but the ambiguity of the ending also takes away that feeling, at least for me. Despite all of that though, I think the ending was actually alright. People are gonna take this to mean that I hated the ending. Let me be clear again, I did not hate the ending at all. I just found that the lack of clarity and the confusion I felt took away from what could have been an awe-inspiring ending. That all being said, I do think that Rebirth is a pretty great game. And if it wasn't already clear by now, I believe, nay, I know, it is definitely a Game of the Year contender. It may not be better in every way from its predecessor, but it's got a whole lot to love. Now onto the actual combat and such. I discussed how it is more refined in my opinion, as it should be, although I have heard some people talk about how there were some components that they preferred in Remake, like the Operator mode and Punisher mode. But I can't really speak to it and the combat's differences in general because I haven't played that one in a while, so my memory is a little bit, clouded. But as far as I can tell, I think that the controls are just a lot smoother. For the bosses in this game, like any Final Fantasy game, I think they're always so cool and so fun to fight, especially when it comes to battling some of the summons, where you can always test out your abilities and test your might. I do feel though, however, that the enemies are more aggressive in this one compared to Remake, and at times it does get a little bit more challenging than I recall it being in Remake. So there's more fluidity to it all, but there's also a greater challenge. Then as far as some of the main bosses go, you'll find that there are a lot of repeating fights with them throughout. I think this is to be expected at this point with really a lot of JRPGs, but it would have been nice to mix it up a little more, you know? So for example, the Turks return as expected, but you need to fight them several times throughout. I like the Turks. I like their characterization and how they serve as a nice roadblock that appears to stop Cloud and the gang in their tracks at every turn. And I even like their newest member Elena, who is this charming yet determined new recruit who's always seeking to prove herself. But while I'm not saying that there wasn't anything new at all in terms of these boss fights, and that I didn't like seeing them, it would have been nice if there was a greater variety of enemy types this time around. The whole cast of characters in Remake were done really well, but Rebirth focuses on them in a much greater capacity, and I feel like the new characters and all the different party members that get introduced are developed so much more, and you really feel this interesting connection to them. Even characters that I think that some people might call annoying, like Yuffie, who they introduced in the Intergrade DLC, which personally I thought was very overpriced. It was $30 for about 2 hours, which is insane. But Yuffie is a great addition, and I really enjoyed all the moments that she was in. Maybe it's a bias thing, but I think she's great, especially during little moments like this.
I am so bored right out of my brain. If I don't die first, betcha I'll go insane. But just wait, oh Materia, I'll get back on the road and make you mine.
Cait Sith 2 is another character that some people don't and won't exactly love either, but unlike Yuffie, I might actually agree to some extent. Either way, they're all fantastically written characters, and I think a part of that has to do with the voice acting and the personality that they instill into them. One common thing that we've seen basically through the last 3 JRPGs that I've played within the last 3 months are the social links. They are present in Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, Persona 3 Reload, and all of its various versions from before, and now here in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. The social links in this game aren't quite as fleshed out or as elaborate as the ones in the other 2, but they do help develop these characters quite a bit. They don't do it to a point where there's like an actual system involved where it really significantly changes the way they play, nor does it actually have any major impacts on the story. But it does help you, as the player, better understand and connect with them, and it does offer varying scenes with varying dialogue options. For example, like who you can take to the Gold Saucer. The way this works is that there are points throughout the game where your party members will have a sort of face icon above their head, like a little emoji, that represents their relationship towards you, and it's during these moments that you can chat with them and try to raise their affinity. And depending on how you interact with them, the answer that you give them, it can affect that link and change the emotion of that icon and its color. And the more that you fill that meter throughout the events of the game, the more it'll affect more of those dialogue options as well, and can determine who joins you as a date at the Gold Saucer. So if you decide that you want to romance Tifa or Aerith, then you gotta make sure that you're answering the right things, and each answer that you will give will have more points than others. However, you won't be able to always tell who has more versus the other, because it takes a few times before that meter gets filled any further. And so there might be one character that has 1 or 2 more points than the other, and you won't really be able to tell unless you yourself have been keeping track. So essentially, you really want to make sure you're interacting with them as much as possible, especially your desired date, in order for those scenes to play out the way you hope, compared to if you don't as many times. Like even in some of the smaller moments, those scenes might change. But if you decide you really don't want to do a whole lot of that and you kind of just want to progress through the story, you absolutely can. You might just not get the same desired outcome. Again, it doesn't affect the core gameplay or the story in any major impactful ways. It's just basically going to decide for you, and if you choose not to invest much time into that, the game will trigger a boys' night out instead, rather than having a more romantic one. So the bottom line is, this could be more or less important to you, depending on who you are and how much you care for it. Interacting with your party members during those moments aren't the only ways to boost them, however. Among the many side quests and other side content that this game is chock full of, some of them include further character development for your party, where one of them, depending on who's present in that quest tab, will accompany you in the quest itself, where they'll actually be present in cutscenes. The rest of your party you've selected will technically be there too, but really only for the combat sequences. Before I move on, I do feel like I have to mention what became part of the reason that this game felt like it had quite a bit of padding. Throughout the game, I suppose in order to develop some of these characters even further, there's usually a dedicated section or two for each one of them, or almost each one. And because of this, the level design was adjusted for those specific characters, where it would often introduce a new mechanic only to never be used again. For the most part, it was fine, but where it really started to wear itself thin was in the last few chapters when they decided not to only lengthen some of the gameplay just for the sake of it, but also introduce mechanics that would slow things down a ton. For those of you who've played this game already, you know what I'm talking about. There's a particular section where one of the characters that you play as has some of the most tedious and janky controls ever. I cannot for the life of me understand how they approved of this level, but it did slow things down a lot. Aside from this though, I think most of these sections were done well and made things quite interesting, like Barrett's section, where we get to explore a little bit more of his backstory. Speaking of backstory, you probably noticed all the footage already of one Zach Fair, and yeah, he plays quite a significant role in this game. Maybe not as much as I would have liked, but still, he's present in a lot of important moments. And so I would highly recommend playing Crisis Core before this, because it does touch on a lot of things regarding him. And it's just so that you get a better understanding of who Zack is as a character and all the moments that are mirrored within this game, especially regarding Sephiroth and his descent into madness. If you'd rather not though, I would at least recommend watching a recap or some video relating to his character, because you won't really be familiar with him otherwise, and there are some crucial moments that won't hit the same way.
Me? Gungaga.
In case you haven't noticed already, there's actually a whole lot to do in this game. The map is just massive. There is a lot to look forward to and discover here, and I think it's all done really well. There are moments where it does start to feel overwhelming with just how much is here, but thankfully, most of the side content in general is optional. And I think for some people here, they're really gonna dig all this stuff. I think they're gonna really love all the side content that this game has to offer, and they'll be spending a lot of time going through each one of them. For other people, maybe they kind of just want to beeline this and ignore a whole lot of this other stuff, and understandably so. Personally, I did some of them as I came across them, but I'm not a completionist and never have been a completionist, so for me, it's not really a priority to do so. But I still had fun and I still did what I came across. But I had heard complaints in the past about Remake and how it handled its side content and side quests. I actually really enjoyed a lot of those. In some ways, more than even here. Simply because of how, while they didn't feel like they were particularly rewarding in any way, the tighter knit levels and smaller map made it feel like I wasn't really going out too much out of my way to go ahead and complete those. It felt like I could just quickly make my way to them and complete them as I head towards my next mission. It didn't feel like much of a detour. Whereas here, there were points where it really did feel like I would have to go out of my way to do so. Again, it's not a big deal because these are mostly optional and lots of games offer this type of setup, but personally, I think I preferred the way that they approached it in Remake just a tad bit more. Although, at the same time, there's a whole lot more that they offered here, and a whole lot more to experiment with and try out. I think this is one of those games where they're really trying to utilize all the different types of content that they want to put into a Final Fantasy game and just try it all. And I actually respect that a lot, because it means that they want to go ahead and take that extra step and initiative to do whatever it is that they want to do, and not just straight up fan service. So let's get into what kind of content you might expect to see. Well, for starters, Chadley returns. Tons of people find him to be really annoying, and I'm one of them. I can't explain why, there's no real reason why I should hate him, but I still kind of do. And I'm sorry to all those Chadley defenders out there, you've gone down a path I cannot follow. But at least he's trying to help. He does provide a lot of assistance with developing materia, as he did in Remake, and he does actually have quite a lot of quests and side content available through him. So across the map, you will have these towers that you will need to activate in order to open up and have a greater view of the map in that area, similar to how viewpoints work in Assassin's Creed. This will pinpoint places to collect data that will help unlock and help aid in your battle simulations that you can use to practice like in the previous games. And depending on what kind of difficulty setting you're playing on, I think it will be a massive help if you are able to do as many of them as possible. Yes, even the chicken one.
Do be careful.
The party ends up taking a lot of detours throughout the game, and amongst them is Costa del Sol, where it's basically your obligatory beach day episode in like every cartoon ever. It's, you know, fun and wild, and it's one of those things where the characters just need to take a break. You know, another thing that we've seen recently in Like a Dragon and Persona 3. And in Costa del Sol, they also have tons of mini games for you to play and try out. One of the ones that I actually really liked was the one where you're playing these soccer-like games as Red, and you have to get the balls into each designated net, sometimes within a limited time frame. And it was really cool that they added just a whole slew of things to do, like that one pirate shooting game. One thing that they actually have at various points during the game, and was even in the demo itself, was the ability to play the piano and play various songs. It's much like how The Last of Us Part 2 introduced guitar play. I don't think it's quite as fine-tuned as the guitar play in Last of Us Part 2, but I think it was an interesting and fun addition that I'm glad that they included. Oh, and how can I forget? As you're traversing through this large map that has various different regions, in each region, going on foot isn't always the most ideal. So they've added these little chocobo stops that you will find scattered across the map, and you will have to follow this little baby chocobo who will guide you to that stop as they wait for you to pick up the sign, which then activates that and then enables you to fast travel to that location. And also, if you have a chocobo in that region unlocked, you can now use them as mount. And speaking of riding chocobos as mounts, there are these chocobo races, which is another minigame that plays a lot like Mario Kart. I mean, Chocobo GP, of course. And like Mario Kart, you are able to customize some of that gear. Instead of it being parts of a car, it's the gear for your chocobo, and depending on what set you have, if it matches, the better stats that you get, and the better chance that you have of winning. There is one particular minigame that I know a lot of people are digging, and I've seen the sentiment like basically all across Twitter and Reddit and all the spaces where people are discussing this game right now. So many people are loving Queen's Blood. Queen's Blood, if you don't know, is a card game. It's basically this game's version of Gwent.
Ever play Gwent?
In a lot of ways, except the difference is, I think a lot of people are enjoying this more. I don't actually really like card games very much. They aren't really my thing, and Gwent was especially never my thing. Every time there was an opportunity in Witcher to play it, I would basically just ignore it. I know, blasphemy. But with Queen's Blood, I actually kind of got the grasp of it. Somewhat. I was actually able to grasp it a lot better, and at some points, I actually kind of enjoyed it. I don't think I loved it as much as most people, but I understand where people were sort of getting that enjoyment and excitement from. And if you are a card player, if you like playing card games, then I think you're gonna have a blast with this. And you're probably gonna spend like 90% of your time playing Queen's Blood and then being like, oh yeah, there's a whole other game too, right? And for those people, I think this is gonna be right up your alley. And if Square Enix doesn't see that and capitalize on that, they're basically just turning away a whole mountain of money. What they could do is make an entire standalone game for it, like what Blizzard did with Hearthstone, or CD Projekt Red did with Gwent, and I'm sure a lot of people will eat it up. So Square Enix, if you're somehow listening, I know you like the sound of money, so make it happen. Alright, so to wrap up, I know it probably sounded like a lot of the things I've been talking about are on the more negative side, and that from all that I've been speaking about during the course of this review, made it seem like that there are more negatives than there are positives. But most of the positives that I would speak to are kind of the things that you probably would have come to expect from this game, and weren't always worth highlighting. But essentially, to sum it up in just a few words, if you like Final Fantasy VII and all of its supplementary and complementary media that is attached to it, from Remake to Advent Children and Crisis Core, you'll probably like this too. It's got a vast and immersive world to explore, a captivating narrative, and as always, an excellent soundtrack to pair. It's also got well-developed characters, and refined and often varied gameplay with all of its side content and minigames, and despite its performance issues and some of the pacing concerns I have with it, it cements its place as a strong entry in the roster of Final Fantasy VII.